Welcome everyone, I'm the Body Counter, and for today I'll be bringing you another episode of Faces of War, where I'll discuss major and minor World War II factions and their history prior, during, and after World War II. Today, I felt compelled to share with you one of the most scarred countries of the conflict. The nation I'm referring to is the first victim of Germany's full-scale blitzkrieg tactics, and the first country to resist German dominance: Poland. Also, apologies if my voice sounds a bit off today. I'm sick while recording this, but I should be better by next week. For some background history, Poland's territory in 1795 was divided between the German, Austrian, and Russian empires. It wouldn't be until the end of World War I, after the fall of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia that Poland would reclaim its independence, which was first guaranteed by US President Woodrow Wilson in his 13th point of peace terms upon the end of the war. The point stated, "An independent Polish state should be erected which should include the territories inhabited by indisputably Polish populations, which should be assured a free and secure access to the sea, and whose political and economic independence and territorial integrity should be guaranteed by international covenant." Józef Pilsudski, the leader of the Polish legions during World War I, would become the chief of state of the Second Polish Republic upon the nation's restoration, and is considered to be the father of modern-day Poland. But peace was far from over. After Poland was reformed, and was given provisional borders after the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, the Soviet Union to the east was determined to reclaim the lost territory of Poland. Around this time, Russia was currently fighting the Ukrainians and Finnish in their own civil wars, and the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The new Russia was beginning to grow their sphere of influence, and the red flag looked like it was starting to loom over the rest of Europe. But there was one new nation standing in their way, and that was Poland. In order for Vladimir Lenin to expand his support for the worldwide revolution, he needed to secure more territory and popularity further west in Europe, starting with the weak German Weimar Republic, and so began the Polish-Soviet War, which would last from February 1919 to March 1921. I won't go super in-depth about this conflict, so I'll cover the main points and the aftermath of the war. A major conflict in 1920 was the Kiev Offensive, a Polish offensive which was assisted by the new ally Ukraine, which had been Poland's enemy prior to 1920. The offensive was successful to start with, making a large push into Belarus and Ukraine, but after a counter-attack close to Kiev, and upon hearing of an imminent Russian offensive, Polish command issued a tactical withdrawal. The Red Army pushed the Polish border dangerously close to the capital of Warsaw, and it would be here that the Polish would tear the Soviet flag from the sky. The Battle of Warsaw would be the ultimate decider of who would be victorious, but due to infighting between the Red Army commanders, Joseph Stalin's insubordination to assist the primary forces at Warsaw, and the decryption of Soviet messages by Polish intelligence officers, the battle was in Poland's hands. After these serious complications, Polish command thought now would be the perfect time to strike, and the Polish army counterattacked the Soviets and forced them into a disorganized retreat. Not long after the Battle of Warsaw, the Soviets would begin peace talks with the Poles. The Peace of Riga was signed on the 18th of March of 1921, and established new eastern borders for Poland. A portion of Belarus and Ukraine was to be granted to Poland, going against the alliance made with Ukraine through the war. After 123 years of being shared between three ruling empires, the Second Republic of Poland was finally free. During the start of the interwar period, Poland was exhausted from its war of independence. Scarred from the Great War and the Polish-Soviet War, rebuilding and restoring the nation's infrastructure, industry, economy, and unemployment rates was the country's highest priority. Much of the nation's industrial capacity was located in the west, which was occupied by the German Empire at the time. The military armament of the Polish army was heavily reliant on scavenged and stolen German, Austrian, and Russian arms before and during the Polish-Soviet War, and it would take a few years for the Republic to increase its armament. In 1926, Pilsudski emerged out of retirement and staged a coup to disband the current president's government, massively reforming the political stance of the nation. From this, Pilsudski formed an authoritarian government and essentially outlawed fascist and communist ideas, boosting his popularity tenfold since his rule of the young republic during its first few years. On top of the current issues Poland faced, the Great Depression intensified the weakened state. Unemployment went through the roof, and farmers were severely impacted, for which they represented more than half of the population. It wouldn't be until the late 1930s that Poland would begin to recover from the Depression and past conflicts, and was starting to be recognised as a dominant European power. All seemed to be improving for Poland, but it wasn't until August of 1939 that things began to take a turn for the worst. To the west, Germany was gearing up for war on Poland. Hitler's plan for Europe would be to establish Lebensraum, or living space, territory in which the native population would be wiped out to make way for the German Aryan race. Poland would be within the planned living space. Nazi propaganda in Germany detailed the Polish population as subhumans or Untermenschen. Both the Jewish populace and the Polish ethnicity entirely were to be exterminated from the country once Germany had successfully occupied the Republic. 3.4 million of the 35 million living in Poland during 1939 were Jewish, making up half of the total Jews murdered during World War II. The 23rd of August marked the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Germany and the Soviet Union, a non-aggression pact and a temporary cooperative alliance for the invasion of Poland. On the 29th of August, Germany demanded the Polish corridor return to them, thus connecting East Prussia to the rest of Germany. But despite many British politicians agreeing that this ultimatum was fair and just, Poland rejected the terms. And so, late on the 31st of August, the Germans staged a false flag attack. German soldiers dressed in Polish uniforms staged a capturing of their own radio station and issued an anti-German radio broadcast in Polish, disguising the incident as a Polish act of sabotage and an excuse for Germany to attack Poland. This event, however, did not convince the Allies, but regardless of the staged attack, the invasion would begin the next day, on the 1st of September, 1939. The invasion of Poland, or Vollweis in German, was to be a swift offensive, consisting of two army groups. Army Group South would contain the bulk of the German forces and would strike from the main German-Polish border to the west, and from the puppet state of Slovakia to the south. Army Group North would strike the Danzig corridor and also attack southwards from East Prussia. Eventually, both army groups would initiate a pincer movement on Warsaw and Brest-Litovsk, trapping many pockets of Polish resistance along the way. The opening of the invasion was largely successful and went without many problems for the Germans. For the Polish, however, they were ill-prepared technologically and were outnumbered, the Germans mobilizing 1.5 million men and Slovakia around 50,000, while the Polish army had around 1 million men at their disposal. The Polish Air Force was also no match for the German Luftwaffe, still utilizing biplanes from the Great War. They did, however, fight bravely in the skies for the short time that they did. Despite the numerical, armament, and communications advantage the Axis forces had, many people are led to believe that the Polish army didn't score their own minor yet important victories against their powerful aggressor. Some battles during the invasion were repelled by the defending Poles temporarily, and some even resulted in tragically higher losses for the Germans when compared to the Polish. But in the bigger picture of the invasion, this was a very small percentage of battles. Some examples of Polish victories or Pyrrhic German victories would be the battles of Mokra and Mława. The Battle of Mokra would be one of Germany's first defeats against the Polish army, in which a Polish counterattack on a German panzer division thrust the Germans into disarray, using cavalry and light armoured tankettes. This battle and the Charge of Krojanty birthed the myth that Polish cavalry units charged head-on with enemy tanks only armed with sabres. This was completely false and was a German propaganda move. In reality, Polish cavalry were being retrained in the use of anti-tank weaponry, such as anti-tank rifles. The Battle of Mława, on the other hand, despite the massive number of German casualties, was deemed as a Polish defeat. The Germans repeatedly attacked the Polish lines and were countered several times, and it would take a further 2 days until the German army was able to advance. The Polish losses were around 2,700, while German losses were a staggering 5,800. On top of this, some 68 German tanks were also destroyed thanks to Polish anti-tank artillery pieces and rifles. A small yet interesting and heroic battle would be the siege of the Danzig Polish post office. Danzig has a hostile history when it comes to Polish-German relations. Danzig was declared a semi-autonomous city-state by the League of Nations. Once the invasion of Poland had begun, the free city of Danzig was annexed by Germany, which the majority of the population welcomed, as 90% of Danzig inhabitants were German, the 10% being Polish. The Polish minority were treated cruelly and would later be executed or worse following the annexation. The siege of the Danzig Polish post office was an assault made by Danzig police and SS soldiers to eliminate the Polish rebels within the post office following the outbreak of the war. The German and Danzig soldiers made several attempts to break into the building, eventually forcing the Polish rebels deeper into the complex. It wasn't until the Danzig Fire Department filled the basement with gasoline and ignited it were the remainder of the defenders forced to surrender. Out of the 56 post office defenders, only 4 survived and managed to escape. The rest had either been killed during the siege or were executed after their surrender. One of the more devastating defeats the Polish endured was the Battle of Tuchola Forest, in which Poland received a total of 10,000 casualties, while Germany only received 850. The battle occurred near the Polish corridor, and upon the German victory, the German army would finally be able to reconnect East Prussia back to the rest of Germany once again. In finally closing off the Polish corridor, one area remained still heavily defended by the Polish army, and this was the Hel Peninsula, off the Polish coast. The Battle of Hel was one of the longest engagements of the invasion, starting on the 9th of September, being fought in the skies, in the sea, and on the ground. Almost 40,000 German infantry would go up against the 2,800 Polish soldiers on the peninsula. Hell had previously been fortified with bunkers along the coast and within the dense forests, and anti-boat and anti-aircraft batteries across the coast and in the urban centres, making the peninsula a fortress itself. Once heavy fighting erupted and the Polish were able to hold the German advance, several torpedoes were placed and detonated on the thinnest segment of the peninsula by Polish teams, separating the Germans from getting across to the Polish side for a long while. The Polish would eventually run low on supplies and would be forced to surrender on the 2nd of October. The longer the invasion continued, the more ground the German attackers covered, enabling them to completely encircle Polish armies and small pockets of troops. One of Poland's most tragic defeats was the Battle of Kuchnio, which was fought from the 9th to the 19th of September, where two Polish armies were completely encircled, resulting in 52,000 casualties and over 150,000 troops captured. This German victory was not assured from the start, however, for it was the Polish who actually struck first during this conflict, starting a brief counter-offensive and pushing the attackers backwards a small distance, before the German infantry would counter-attack themselves and completely surround the infantry and cavalry of the Polish units. Only a small fragment of the armies were able to break the encirclement to regroup in Warsaw. It wouldn't be until the 17th of September that the Soviet Union would join Germany in the invasion of Poland. Though the Russians would mobilise around 500,000 men, which was only a third of the number Germany massed for the fall of Weiss, the Soviet forces would drive more pressure on the already crumbling nation. Polish treatment in Soviet territory was just as grim as German-occupied territory. Millions would be sent off to Siberian work camps for the remainder of the war, or until their German ally would backstab them. Just before the Soviet entry into the invasion, one of the decisive battles of the war would be won by the invading force, during the Battle of Brest-Litovsk. The city was the second most important urban position in Poland, the first being Warsaw, and Brest-Litovsk had been a major target of a massive pincer movement. What started as small engagements between both forces ended with a German assault on the city and its heavily reinforced fortress. The Poles would make use of French FT-17 light tanks and armoured trains. The French tanks, however, wouldn't last and were completely wiped out during the battle. The two branching German forces took turns advancing deeper into Brest-Litovsk, eventually leading to a Polish withdrawal from the city. But the losses of Brest-Litovsk were negligible when compared to the ultimate downfall of Poland, the Siege of Warsaw. A battle which started on the 8th of September, not including the air raids which started on the 1st. The initial battle would begin with attempts to push into the city, though many were counter-attacked by the determined Poles, and it would require a lot more artillery and air raids to weaken the area before pushing in. The siege would also call the civilian population to arms, as the elderly, women, and children grabbed any weapon they could find, and joined their nation's army in defending their capital. Improvised trenches and fortifications were erected to hold the advancing force back, and many weakened Polish armies had reorganised in Warsaw for one final stand. German artillery and the Luftwaffe attacks hammered the city and crippled the civilian population, and it was after these attacks that the infantry and armoured forces would finally be able to assault the softened capital successfully. What followed was fierce street combat and house-to-house skirmishes between both sides, ultimately ending with the Polish being defeated, suffering around 158,000 killed, wounded and captured, while German casualties range around 20,500. The siege would last for 20 days, and Warsaw would not see any kind of liberation from Nazi rule until the end of the war. The last major Polish resistance wouldn't be crushed until the 5th of October, finally putting the end to the Polish aggression, for now that is. After the fall of Poland, the lands were partitioned between the USSR and Germany, much like it was in 1795, with even a bit of territory going to Slovakia. What remained of the Polish army would relocate to France, through Hungary, Romania and even Scandinavia. A nation destroyed, the people oppressed and murdered, but all would not be lost for those who escaped in time, for they would play a bigger role in the years to come, and those brave enough to stay would lead a strong underground resistance group, poised to strike when the time was right. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Faces of War, and next week I'll be discussing part 2 of Poland, their government now in exile, their armed forces in the west, and the Polish underground state and their contribution for liberating their homeland and bringing their oppressor down from the shadows. If you enjoyed, leave a like to show your support, join my Discord in the description below to be a member of the growing community, subscribe to keep up to date for when I upload next, and as always, continue gaming on.